Dobry den, Batimo. It is indeed an honor to be able to join you here today. Eugene, distinguished guests from around the world, ladies and gentlemen. This is an important conference for you, and I'm so glad to see that you're holding it here in Canada. Walter, I have to thank you for organizing the event and adjusting to my schedule. I do appreciate it. I didn't want to throw things in disarray, but for those of you who are visiting, this is Veterans Week, and it coalesces with Remembrance Day tomorrow. It's important I'm back in my writing for that. There's events taking place all this week honoring our veterans. You know, we're talking about the aggression of Russia in Ukraine and Ukraine's fight for their own independence right now. But from those of us from liberal democracies and free countries, we honor our veterans this week, and it coalesces in Canada on November the 11th, and it's something that I'm deeply indebted to because my Bubba and Guido, when they came to Ukraine, my one great uncle served in both World War I and World War II fighting for Canada. Now, I always get a little jealous of Eugene and Yuri. They get up here and they can speak in Canada's official languages, English, French, and Ukrainian. And I wish I had that type of eloquence as well, so I do appreciate it. And I have to say that on the 50th anniversary of the World Ukrainian Congress, that this is a significant and historic event. The work that you have done over the past 50 years has accumulated into policies, legislation, and support, not just within governments from around the world, but support of our citizens as well, who have no connection at all to Ukraine, other than having a neighbor who is of Ukrainian descent. Maybe they've gone to Malonka. You know, maybe they've celebrated Ukrainian Christmas with their colleagues, but that has resonated across our countries. Now, this is Canada's 150th birthday as well, and we're celebrating an amazing accomplishment of modern Canada and how it has come to be one of the strongest, freest democracies, peace and prosperity in 150 years. We've never been invaded or had to live through what Ukraine's going through today. And in that celebration, we're also celebrating earlier this year the 125th anniversary of Ukrainian migration to Canada. And, you know, I often say that Canada was maybe founded by the French and the English, but Western Canada in particular, where I'm from, it was built by Ukrainians. And I remember talking to my Guido and my Bubba and the hard work that they had going out in Western Canada, you know, moving out of beautiful Chernovitzy Oblast and, you know, coming to Canada and having to work the fields, pick the stones, clear the bush, pick the roots, plant a crop, raise a family. You know, prairie fires would come in. There wasn't, you know, national disaster relief agencies around to get it done. They went out there and fought the fires themselves. So it is something that when you think about how hard that work was, but what that blood, sweat, and toil coalesced into as a nation, and the peace and prosperity that we enjoy today as Canadians is something to be celebrated. You know, while I'm up here, I'm going to brag a little bit, Walter, about being a Canadian and about being a Ukrainian Canadian. And you think about multiculturalism in Canada. And the father of multiculturalism was Senator Paul Usick, who brought it in through the Senate of Canada and was adopted by the government of the day. You know, Canada was the first Western country that recognized Ukrainian independence in 1991 under Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. And Canada was the first Western country to recognize the Holodomor as a genocide when they passed my private member's bill in 2008. Now, you know, Canada has been leading on supporting Ukraine during these very difficult times. It was through the hard work of Stephen Harper, when he was Prime Minister of Canada at the G8 and the G20, to start isolating Vladimir Putin and his Kremlin kleptocrats, pushing Russia out of the G8 and going back to the G7, making sure that we brought in the right sanctions regimes and to slow down Russia's aggression. And Canada has been there for Ukraine in providing military aid, military reforms, training police forces, reforming the judicial system, helping civil society, and operating with Ukrainian troops in training them through Operation Unifier, in helping Ukraine modernize the military to NATO standards. You know, we started the Defense Cooperation Arrangement. I'm glad to see that our current Liberal government has signed that. Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement to ensure that there is prosperity and hope and chances for Ukrainian business to do trade with Canada and Canada to do trade with Ukraine. These things are all important to ensure that Ukraine has the same type of opportunities that we take for granted here in Canada, in the United States, in Australia, in Western Europe, and around the world. They need to have our support, and that's why it's so important. And I'm glad that just earlier this month that the Canadian Parliament unanimously adopted, after much negotiations and hard work, the Sergei Magnitsky law that was sponsored by sponsored by Senator Raynell Andrechuk and in the Senate, and myself in the House of Commons. And to have that unanimous support after what looked like pretty dismal times when Stephen Dion was still the foreign minister, didn't look like it was going to succeed, but I do have to give a big shout out to Minister Chrystia Freeland for standing up, for bringing her caucus on side and putting in place a sanctions regime that's already been implemented against 52 people, including 40 Russians, and President Maduro from Venezuela is at the top of the list. And then I encourage other countries that have yet to bring forward Magnitsky legislation, keep it global, make sure that you're concentrating not just on Russia's and that this isn't a Russian-phobic bill. This is about standing up for human rights and ensuring that your countries aren't being used as safe havens for those corrupt foreign officials who are enriching themselves by abusing their positions of power and authority and are not using your financial institutions and your safe property rights that you have to hide their wealth and to hide their families and often their girlfriends. You know, so let's make sure that we keep them from using us so that we can send a strong message to them that their behavior is unacceptable. Now, if you look at the work of the World Ukrainian Congress over the past 50 years, and I know I hear this often from even in people of Ukrainian heritage in my own riding of Selkirk and Lake Eastman, and they often say, like, why are we standing up for Ukraine? And so it's so important that each and every one of your organizations continue to not only spread Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian language, but it's about also instilling upon each and every one of us that sense of patriotism. And I know that when I talk to people in Ukraine, and they say, why is Canada standing with Ukraine? And so much of it has to do with that sense of patriotism, that Ukrainian national identity that our forefathers had when they came to Canada, when they came to the United States, Australia, and other countries. And because of your hard work, that patriotism and that national identity has infiltrated our entire society and culture. And it's not just about diaspora politics when we start talking about these things at the political levels. It's about doing what is principled and what is right and what is just. And because of your influence, it makes our jobs in Parliament, in our Congresses, much easier. Now, I know I'm supposed to talk a little bit about the North Atlantic, the Euro-Atlantic community, and why Canada's support and why Ukraine's territorial integrity and their European aspirations is so important. And I just got back from a trip with our Standing Committee on National Defense, which I'm the Vice Chair, where we visited NATO headquarters in Brussels. We visited our troops at the enhanced forward position in Latvia through Operation Reassurance, and we visited our troops in Ukraine as well. And I was able to convince the members of our committee that not only should we be doing a study of NATO and how Canada functions within NATO and Russian aggression against NATO allies, but we should do a separate report just about how we can help Ukraine through military and developmental support. And I can tell you that it became clear, I think, to all members of our committee, which is all partisan, which is all parties in the House of Commons, that if Ukraine fails, Europe fails. If Putin is successful in undermining the sovereignty of Ukraine, of destroying its economic and prosperity aspirations of being part of free trade and free markets and free societies, then that will infiltrate through the rest of Europe. And those who are Russian apologists and those who are appeasing Putin in Europe and elsewhere, including here in Canada, are the thin edge of the wedge of undermining our Western democracies. And so we have to be successful in Ukraine. We have to stand alongside our ally. We have to support the reforms, and we have to stop the imperial aspirations and ambitions of Vladimir Putin and his Kremlin kleptocrats. Now, the greatest threat from the standpoint of Europe is the hybrid warfare that the Russian Federation has perfected. You know, it starts with that disinformation campaign. And how do we undermine and counter RT, Sputnik, and other propaganda machines for the Kremlin? Our media, you know, being a free and open media that we have, the free press is critical to our democracies. But it is inherent upon each and every one of us to counter the misinformation and the propaganda being spewed by the Putin regime. I get trolled on Facebook almost every day, on Twitter. You know, they're out there, and I sometimes get called some pretty nasty names, but I can tell you that social media in particular now is something that we have to be more and more engaged in. In Canada alone, 34+ million people, 9 million Canadians, #1 source of news is Facebook. It's not the Globe and Mail, definitely not the Toronto Star. And only in Toronto would you say Toronto Star is a national newspaper. Out west, we look to the sky. It's Toronto Star. But, you know, we have to be more innovative. We have to counter what is being pushed out there and point out the misinformation. And then, of course, we have cyber warfare, and we actually have a bill in the House of Commons right now, which we'll start debate on in 1 week's time, which will provide Canada, for the first time ever, the capability to not only do cyber defense, but to go on the attack in the cyberspace. And those threats that are not just always hacking and malware and phishing, they also, as we've seen in Estonia, as we've seen in Ukraine, they go after critical infrastructure, train systems, electrical grids, communications, and of course, all the hacking that they do, not just from an espionage point of view, from information gathering from our defense agencies, but also from the corporate world. So we have to be able to protect that better. So the foreign policies of our countries, of Canada and our allies, particularly those NATO allies and the North Atlantic, who are so critical to peace and security across the world, to ensuring that we have that prosperity which we all have come to rely upon. Right now, it starts in Ukraine. For those of you who are from Ukraine, I know that we have some members of parliament. I met this morning with the Minister of Health. And what I always like to say to them is thank you for your troops. Take back to your military and tell them that we appreciate that they are the front line. They are the ones that are standing in the way of Putin's imperialistic aggression. And if he is allowed to march across Ukraine, who knows where he stops? The English Channel? So it is inherent again that we get together and support Ukraine. And that's why, as the official opposition, we're still calling upon the Government of Canada to reinstate the supply of radar-sat images so that Ukraine can see what's happening in Donbass and along the Russian border. We are calling upon Canada to put Ukraine on the automatic firearms country control list so that they can buy weapons from Canada in a much more expeditious manner. We are calling on the government to supply lethal defensive weapons to Ukraine, because if you ever want to get to a position of properly negotiating a peace treaty with Russia, you got to do it from the position of strength. Putin understands strength. Weakness provokes him. And Ukraine has to be able to match power with power, artillery with artillery, so that we can get Putin to the negotiation of actual peace and security. And finally, just yesterday, Andrew Scheer, our leader, announced in Etobicoke that Canada should not only be supporting President Poroshenko's call for a UN peacekeeping mission on the Russia-Ukraine border so we can get control of Donbass, but that Canada should lead that mission. Canada should champion this at the United Nations to work with like-minded nations and our allies to force Vladimir Putin and the Russian Federation on the UN Security Council to accept a UN peacekeeping force so that we can find our way to a position that Donbass can heal, that people can return home, and that then the democratic processes can work. In closing, I just want to say that on behalf of the official opposition, and indeed on behalf of all members of Parliament, we express our greatest gratitude to everyone in the World Ukrainian Congress, all of the organizations from around the world, for your hard work, for your support, for keeping us as politicians educated and informed. And I know that as we go forward and the situation in Ukraine continues to evolve, that relationship will become more important, that our resolve and determination to work together for the betterment of the great people of Ukraine is something that we all will share so that we can finally achieve true united Ukraine, where every acre or hectare, depending where you're from, is under the control of an independent, sovereign, and democratic Ukraine. Thank you very much.